I go into the synaptic problem now. And what is the synaptic problem? The synaptic problem is basically what happens when you compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so there's going to be similarities and there's going to be differences. Now, when there's similarities, there's no problem, okay? When the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all say the same thing, that's not really a problem. But these three gospels seem to be very similar, so they call it synaptic. And then when you get synaptic, synoptic. Sun in Greek means with, optic like optician, ophthalmology, with one eye. Okay, so the synaptic problem says that these three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, see Jesus with one eye. John, on the other hand, John is totally different. John gives a totally different perspective. So kind of as you need two eyes to give you depth perception, and you have two eyes so that you can realize that chair is closer, the clock in the back of the room is much further, and you have depth perception because you have two eyes. They're actually developing now video cameras with two cameras shooting, and then almost like our eyes to give the sense of, even in video camera work now, of this three dimensions now. It's really kind of neat what's happening. But what you have is Matthew, Mark, and Luke giving one perspective and John giving another one. Very different perspectives between the synaptics. But among the synaptics, those are all with the same eye. There's similarities, great similarities and great differences. And so we want to look at that. And so synaptic, okay, synaptic with one eye. With one eye. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, see Jesus with one eye. Now, what's interesting is that in the early church saw the differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and yet they didn't squash them together. They allowed each witness, Matthew is different than Mark, is different than Luke. They're very similar, but there's differences. Normally, if you would want some sort of agreement, you would think historically, if the text were malleable, or if the text were plastic, you would expect people then to say, oh, we need to make Matthew and Mark agree. And so where they disagree, you'd have people harmonizing them, illegitimately harmonizing them, but that didn't happen. They left the differences, the early church left the differences in the text. And that tells me something about the historicity of these documents. It wasn't that, oh, okay, the church is playing around with these documents. These documents are very malleable, and they're just legends made up, and so you can tweak the legends to make them fit together. No, they didn't look at it that way. They looked at the documents that they had, and they left them stand. And they left them stand even at the points where there were major clashes. They left the clashes in. They didn't harmonize them. And so, very interesting, the early church didn't correct and harmonize and things like that. They left them stand with these differences, and we'll look at some of the differences in a minute. What does it say about their belief in the sanctity of the text and the historical reliability? The historical reliability of the text. As Christians, we are very linked into history. Our theology rises out of history. It's not that our theology gives birth to history. No. It's history, real events happening. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Jesus ministered in Galilee and walked on the waters in Galilee. Jesus died in Jerusalem and rose again on the third day. Those are historical events. And those historical events then, in other words, Christianity is built on real history. And then our theology comes off the history. So history is incredibly important. So the historical reliability of those three Gospels that tell us about Jesus are incredibly important. The same way for the Jewish people that the book of Exodus and the Pentateuch are very important for them. The coming out of Egypt and God bringing them out of Egypt with a strong arm, an outstretched arm, and the mighty hand and things. So, So the New Testament, very historical, reliable. They didn't squash things together. They didn't say, well, these legends don't agree, so we'll fudge them to make them fit better. They left them each stand. Why not legend? Okay? Part of the problem why the Gospels aren't legend is that you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark writing probably before, 60 A.D., and Luke writing before Paul was dead. Paul dies about 68. Luke writes to Most Excellent Theophilus, probably as a defense of the Apostle Paul. So it's probably before Luke is probably pretty firmly before 65. Matthew maybe a little bit after that, but all these guys writing in that before 70 AD kind of thing. And because the temple destruction is not mentioned in any of these Gospels, and so before 70 AD, well, that's what, 30, 40 years after Jesus, okay? Now you say a lot changes in 30, 40 years, but the problem is this. Is 30 or 40 years time enough for a whole legend about Jesus to grow up? And the answer is no. The problem is you've got eyewitnesses still living. You've got eyewitnesses still living that can confirm Jesus either did this or Jesus didn't do this. And so because of the life of eyewitnesses, you can't fudge that stuff that much. Kind of reminds me of a woman named Sonia Weitz. We had her at Gordon College here for years. Dr. Marv Wilson, who's kind of the legend at Gordon College, a phenomenal teacher, phenomenal individual that teaches here in Old Testament. He has developed a real integration with the Jewish community on the North Shore of Boston here. And he's gotten to know Sonia Weitz, and she was a Holocaust survivor. And so she would get up once a year. Marv would bring her in. Marv and Polly would bring in Sonia Weitz, and she would give a lecture then at Gordon College on being a survivor. And she would describe the Holocaust. And actually, I've got a video of this. And she would describe the Holocaust and what it was like for she and her sister. The rest of her family, I think, perished in the Holocaust. And she and her sister went to some of the major, I'm not sure whether Auschwitz or Buchenwald or which one it was, but she was to several of them, got on the train, was packed in a train car with like 200 people, and basically just totally humiliated and things like that. And she would describe the Holocaust. Now, what's the problem? People can't fudge on the Holocaust because there's still people alive. Sonia Weitz remembered the Holocaust. She was there. So when a guy like Ahmadinejad or some crazy guy gets up in Iran and says, there was really no Holocaust, that was all made up by the Jews, sorry, Sonia Weitz was there, okay? And by the way, even Eisenhower, I believe General Eisenhower, when they went in to free those camps and stuff, he said, people will never believe what happened here. And so he had all those things documented. They took photographs and they documented that whole thing because he said people will never believe it. And so that is very well documented. Even with it well documented, you've still got crazy people saying it never happened and things. So, but the problem is that you can call those people's bluffs because Sonia, she was there, she was an eyewitness, and she bears witness to the fact of what it was like to be in the concentration camps under Hitler. And so there's nobody can challenge her. That was her experience. She was there, she and her sister. The problem, now what's one of the problems? The problem is Sonia died just a few years ago, and so now she doesn't come and tell her story anymore, and so that's what's happening to a lot of the survivors of the Holocaust. They're dying out. And so therefore you don't have this witness now, and we're in 2011, 2012 now, and the Holocaust happened, in the 1940s, so we're talking 60, 70 years there, and so now these people are dying off. Well, see, with Mark, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you're still back within the 20, 30, 40-year range, so there's plenty of people around who actually can witness to these events. So that's all I'm saying. So you don't have time for a legend, and you have too many people. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, there were 500 people that saw Jesus alive after he rose from the dead. 500 people, as well as the 12, and as well as the women, as well as these two people from the Emmaus Road. So how many witnesses does it take before a person says that really happened? You got 2 witnesses, you're pretty good. You got 1 witness, you may wonder. You got 2 witnesses, that ups the probability quite a bit. What do you got when you get 11 and 12 witnesses at a time? What happens when you get 500 witnesses all at one time, different places, different times, different settings? This Emmaus Road, he had never been probably down Emmaus Road before. There's no record of that in Scripture. And so these people have no association with Jesus in this area, and yet Jesus meets them on the road to Emmaus. So, and that's 2 of them, 2 witnesses. So it's not just one thing. So, not legend, historical reliability. Now, things wouldn't be covered up like the disciples. If you were writing a gospel about Jesus, would you, as an apostle, you were one of the 12 guys, would you tell all the dumb things that the apostles do? Jesus is in a boat with them, and he starts telling them, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. And the disciples start saying, oh man, we forgot to take bread, and Jesus is getting mad at us because he didn't have anything to eat. So he's talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, but it's really that he's hungry because we forgot bread. And Jesus says, hey, get a clue. If I want bread, excuse me, how many did I just feed? I just fed 5,000, man. If I want bread, I can make bread, manna from heaven. I mean, God gave manna from heaven. If I want manna from heaven, we can do that. Okay? And he says, you don't understand the disciples. So the disciples are played at a certain point as not understanding Jesus over and over and over again. They just didn't get it. Now, if you were the one writing that, and you were one of the apostles, wouldn't you delete those kind of stories and that just made your friends, the people that you hung out with for those years? Many of those people who are now in the process of going out spreading the gospel are getting killed. And would you tell those negative stories about them? But yet the gospel expose the disciples, and they're just not getting it, not understanding it. Jesus eating with tax collectors and things. You would think that they'd want it to up his status and stuff, and rather than having him hang around with these illegitimate women like Mary Magdalene and the tax collectors, you'd put him out there with, the Herods and the Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Pontius Pilates, and you'd have him hanging out with the bigwigs. But instead, who does he hang out with? These tax collectors and sinners, and we don't even know many of their names and stuff, but that Jesus had a reputation for, the Samaritans. Again, the same thing. If you're a good Jewish person, why would you feature the Samaritans when you know that's offensive to all the Jewish people and things, and yet the Gospels keep coming back to this. Jesus hung out with the Samaritans. It gives you true history, even though knowing that true history is going to be offensive to some people. In other words, Jesus was not necessarily politically correct. And so he talks about his relationships with the Samaritans, even knowing that would bring opposition. The unbelief of the disciples. His own disciples did not believe in him at points. His own family at certain points, coming to take Jesus away because they thought his own family members, James and Joseph and his mother, coming to take him, they're coming to take you away. They're coming to take you away. And so they come to take Jesus away because he's crazy. They think he's crazy. And his own brothers, just reading in another passage where and this is from the book of John. Sorry for jumping to John, but John, they're going up to the Feast of Tabernacles. And his brothers say, hey, Jesus, why don't you do your miracles that you do? Why don't you go down to Jerusalem and show everybody these miracles you do? And then the narrator in John says, because his own brothers and sisters, his own brothers did not believe in him. His own brothers. They say, hey, go down to Jerusalem, do these miracles. Because they didn't believe in him. And those kind of things, if you were writing a history of a hero, you would cover those things up. You would cover them up. Peter denies the Lord. Peter's going to be one of the big guys in the early church. I mean, this is the Apostle Peter. This is Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. And yet the Gospels all record Peter denies the Lord 3 times. What kind of if you were writing a history, wouldn't you skip things of your friend Peter and just say, okay, he made some mistakes? You don't feature the mistakes of your friends in the way you write your history. But yet the gospel has Peter denying the Lord just before his crucifixion. 3 times denying him. Not just once, 3 times. And Peter going out and weeping because of that stuff. You would cover those kind of things up. And what I'm trying to say is the Gospels give us accurate history. That they put out the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's some ugly stuff there. They put that out there. And so this is real history. This isn't made-up history. This isn't ideal, legendized history or mythological history that they make this myth. They make Jesus into this myth. No, they give you the real history. And so the historical reliability, this guy named Craig Blomberg out at Denver Seminary has written a really nice book, 400- or 500-page book on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Really critical book. I mean, if you're wondering about this stuff, he goes through and establishes a lot of the historical reliability of the New Testament, and particularly the Gospels, the Synaptic Gospels. Craig Blomberg's book, Historical Reliability of the Gospels and stuff, really worth reading. So,